Coastal Zone Act is just one of the items on the agenda as the legislature hurdles towards June 30th. Steve Tanzer from DelawareLiberal.net is here to talk a little bit about that. And the curious thing about changing the coastal zone, there's a lot of emotions attached to it. Of course, Russ Peterson's legacy is part of that emotional connection. There's also the environmental reform versus business interests. Where is all this headed?
Keep in mind that the coastal zone really is part of Delaware's identity and has been for 40 years. I mean, people in Delaware have been proud that Delaware had the foresight to try to protect some of its most vulnerable areas with legislation that would hopefully forestall spills, environmental disasters, and what have you. So that's been a history over 40 years. What we have now, of course, is moves to change the coastal zone, and I think the primary controversy seems to revolve around what they call bulk transfer, which essentially is either trains bring in or take out hazardous materials, they unload them and load them. And so that's really the controversy, whether or not under the new Coastal Zone Act it's going to get to the point where some of those environmental protections are really threatened. The other controversy with the bill, and where does it go from here? Good question. Because the bill was introduced at the end of May, and the very first opportunity, the first legislative committee hearing in June after they came back, they considered it. The question is, are they going to try to fast track this bill before the end of June or not? I think that would be a huge mistake. You're going to try to change 40 years of a legacy in that period of time in a bill that really a lot of people don't understand exactly what's in it, especially when you already have some precedent. You've seen what happens at IPC or whatever they call that oil refinery this week with the bulk transfers that they were doing in violation of the law but didn't bother to tell anybody. Right. So you end up with businesses that are almost too big to fail because of the jobs it offers. Right. So that's a lot of what the controversy is. I would hope they would wait, have the bill considered in public hearings throughout the state during the break. And
a lot of other things are going to take up a lot of the oxygen.
Yes.
And one of those things, of course, the budget and final defect numbers are out next week. Do you think there's some sort of magic nugget out there that sometimes appears in June?
Not this year. You're talking a $400 million deficit. I mean, even if they magically find another 25 mil somewhere, right, which seems less likely now that there are fewer real revenue sources available to the state. No. It's just going to be a real hash out to get this budget finalized, especially now that you have the Republicans tying any support for different budgetary revenue enhancers to things like rolling back prevailing wage and cutting back on Medicaid provisions as well.
And there's also been some discussion about minimum wage as well, increasing the minimum wage. And that bill was tabled earlier in the week and then brought back up, I think, back on the agenda late this week.
Maybe. It was supposed to be heard on Tuesday. It was not considered on Tuesday. So I don't know what's happening. I do know this, though, that the Democratic Party's platform, the state of Delaware, provides for supports a $15 minimum wage. This minimum wage bill over the course of 4 years would raise Delaware's minimum wage to $10.25. It will pass if all Democrats support it, which is a bigger if.
Yeah,
yes.
Right. And it is always fascinating what lawmakers decide is a priority. And I think a lot of people probably didn't know that Delaware never had an official abortion law, and now the state does. Why was that important to do this session?
Well, it was important. Delaware did have an abortion law. However, when Roe v. Wade became the law of the land back in, I think, 1973, that superseded Delaware's law, okay, which supporters of a woman's reproductive rights would view as very draconian. If Roe v. Wade were to be overturned, and that's what the fear is, that if Trump is able to get one more judge on the Supreme Court to maybe replace someone who has supported Roe v. Wade, that law would go by the books. Absent doing this, you would have had a very draconian statute on the Delaware books. This essentially codifies the protections in Roe v. Wade as Delaware law.
Separate from the federal law.
Well, I mean, right now, well, the law is Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Separate, but if that is reverted to the states, then state law would take precedence, and Delaware's statute was very draconian.
Okay.
Now it isn't.
And as we wrap up here, I'm sure in a couple of weeks we'll have a better answer to this question. But as we come to the end of the legislative session, if you had to give Governor Carney a grade, it's his report card time. Where does he stand?
Right now, at best, a D, because he really hasn't gotten involved. The lack of leadership and the lack of vision, even on the budget issue. I was reading the article in the paper. He's like, well, I hope they get together and resolve this. The governor's office traditionally has always been deeply involved in these negotiations. Other than setting up that sort of mathematical formula of, I want 50% in revenue enhancers, 50% in cuts, I have not seen that leadership. So at best, a D. Only a D because he says he supports minimum wage increase.
All right, we'll see how it all turns out. Steve Tanzer, DelawareLiberal.net, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Take care.